welcome back. Now with us is Wenqi Shao from Webflow. She is a lead staff data scientist now there. Works on building Webflow's product decision science team, and previously worked at Facebook, Uber, Flexport, Cash App. Is there any other like mega companies that you haven't worked at? She graduated from Stanford with a BS in mathematical and computational science and a BA in economics, and just to throw it for good measure, has an MS in financial math. So you've done more math than I think I would do in 14 lifetimes. So I'm quite impressed by that. If so, we've been asking a question for every so you work at Webflow. We've been asking a question about summer for everybody that is about to talk. You see a lot of Webflow data. I'm curious, and I have a backup question if this was out there too much, but is there any website that you've seen that's built on Webflow that is like, oh, that's a cool website for this summer?
I think Meow Wolf is one of our customers, and they do very immersive art, exhibitions. I think their websites are similarly very cool to look at.
Awesome. Okay, sweet. I'm looking it up. I don't know why I just changed my tab. I just really threw myself a curveball there. Well, it's the talk is called Product Analytics Roles Through the Decades: My Journey in Data Science Over the Last Decade. Wenqi, I look forward to hearing this, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Wenqi, like Trevor mentioned. I've been a product analyst or data scientist for the last decade at various tech companies, and today I'm just going to share my journey and talk about the different roles at the various companies. So to start, I graduated from college in 2009 when data science was not yet a profession. I majored in a degree program called Math and Computational Science, which was a combination of math, statistics, and computer science, which I later learned morphed or got rebranded into what was considered a data science minor. I also got a master's in financial math, which is a program run from the stats department, and I have now noticed that they offer a data science master with very similar coursework. So I think as a whole, the data science career was created more or less in 2013. When Facebook decided to rebrand everyone's titles to data scientist from product analyst or growth analyst or whatever. And what was formerly their data science team now became core data science, which now are sometimes called research scientists. And those roles usually involve more advanced degrees and sophisticated modeling, deep learning, and specialized niche use cases. So as you all might know, the data science title is fairly confusing and can mean a variety of things depending on the company that you are working for. Since Facebook, I've had the opportunity to have a number of roles at various larger and smaller tech companies. So I'm going to be talking about the key differences and challenges we've faced at each. And as I learned best practices and watched the growth of each company, I've wanted to go increasingly smaller companies to apply those learnings and gain the opportunity to work on new areas, help grow and build a team. Personally, I've shied away from companies that are a little too small that you don't really need anything beyond Excel to work on your data. So to start, I worked at Facebook between 2012 and 14 on the growth analytics team, focusing on internet.org and Messenger, right as it was being split out from the main app. After I left, I later realized that we had best-in-class in-house data tooling, and even back in 2014, that the rest of the industry is still trying to replicate. For example, we had Deltoid, which was Facebook's experimentation tool, and it allowed analysts to simply add the set of custom metrics that they wanted for their particular experiment, and then Deltoid would handle everything else, all the core metrics, statistical results, default segmentation. Facebook also had a tool called FastDrill that allowed us to diagnose and break down the change in any core metric and understand what segments were contributing to the movement and how much. And Data Swarm is the tool that later became Airflow, which a lot of you probably know, and is a common ETL management tool. So I feel like a lot of my journey after leaving Facebook has been trying to replicate a lot of the tools that we saw and rebuild them at different companies. And with all this tooling that we did have there, data scientists were then able to focus on metric development and deeper dives into specific product usage and performance. And then I joined Uber. At the time, the company was growing very fast, and it was a very metrics-driven culture. We were launching new features very quickly, and there were weekly reviews and deep dives into how the business was performing. Over time, there we had to build processes and infrastructure that supported the company's rapid scaling and headcount. So, for example, we actually had a lot of folks, ops folks in particular, that were just SQL savvy enough to write their own SQL queries. But then that created the problem of different numbers being used in reporting and analyses, and everyone having their own results for the questions they were asking. So we needed to create a system of starred or validated queries and dashboards. And in the beginning, there was actually no dashboarding solutions. So many teams created their own R Shiny dashboards, and then those became quite impossible to find, and there was quite a proliferation of those as well. Another example is that a lot of processes were actually scaled very manually. So in Monday mornings in 2015, we actually ran very complex SQL queries to figure out how much incentives to pay drivers based on the different regional incentive structures that we had set up on a weekly basis. But Mondays are also when analysts were updating all their KPI reports, so no one's queries were able to run in time. And there was considerable effort then invested in data infrastructure over the next few years so everyone could actually get the data that they needed quickly and reliably. Every team also ran their own experiments in the beginning. So the company undertook a multi-year effort to commonly define core experiment metrics and set up experimentation infrastructure. In order to keep moving fast, there were user tags that we used everywhere to indicate specific experiments, messaging, or any other user groups, but it was almost impossible to keep track of all these tags. And then our operations folks could set up geofences for specific campaigns or features, but then there soon became so many geofences for a similar area. So there was a lot of coordination, I think, that needed to happen just as the company grew at such a rapid pace between all the teams, between ops and eng and product and data to ensure we were using the right information. In 2017, I joined Flexport because I thought instead of moving people around, it would be interesting to solve the challenge of moving things around. Flexport was my first B2B company, and there I learned about a whole new suite of data challenges, primarily around data quality and the appetite for data insights. So the vision of Flexport is to digitize, automate, and then optimize freight forwarding. However, the steps of digitizing and automating takes quite a while. So first, the problem with the antiquated freight forwarding industry is that a lot of processes are analog and manual, which means that our input data sources were also manually entered by humans. For example, it's hard to know when exactly a shipment was dropped off at the port. Someone could just enter in a date instead of a date timestamp, and they could just write in whatever time they were inputting the data instead of when the shipment actually got dropped off. And then we also did not control the data sources. So think of your cable bill and all the random line items on it. Now multiply that by 100 different carriers. And we spent a lot of time just trying to cost our line items and validating the data against what we were billed. So I think in a B2B environment, we spent a lot of time identifying data issues and validating data and building dashboards to identify outliers and enable operations to operate most effectively and chase down the issues that we saw. And then in 2018, the company shifted its focus to mid-market and enterprise customers. And with that change, there was actually a much less appetite and ability for experimentation. There were a few interesting data science projects we did work on. For example, figuring out which air cargo to assign to which flight most optimally. But the problem was that customers would often not know the size, weight, or dimensions of their cargo until it was dropped off too late, and we had limited visibility on other cargo on the plane. So the algorithm worked great on the 5% of the time that it was applicable. We did some data tooling as well. A lot of our stakeholders were operations and business folks that were not particularly data or SQL savvy. So we started off with Periscope when I joined, but Periscope is a SQL interface that was not very user-friendly, and we took on a very large multi-month effort to migrate to Looker in 2020 so that operations folks could be much more self-serve. Next, I wanted to work in fintech, so I joined Cash App. Cash App was an interesting company because even though it was part of Square, now known as Block, it had its own separate infrastructure, and its growth had exploded during the pandemic with the stimulus checks, but a lot of their more manual processes were not yet scaled. So we spent a lot of time building out the necessary data infrastructure to continue its growth. I remember when I first joined that an engineer on the growth team had to coordinate being online to push code when the PM wanted to send out a notification message. As the engineers built out more scalable tools, we on the data science side also needed to build out data models that could support these multiple use cases. For example, a lot different types of messaging. We wanted to connect to various downstream actions, and we needed to think about that in a holistic way. There had also just been early on in the days a dump of all the performance logs, server pings, and client eventing data into one giant table with random naming conventions. And we took on a big effort to try to identify which events we actually wanted, set up naming conventions, and then migrate the mobile event data into separate segment tables. The other challenge we had was Cash actually had pretty good product market fit early on. A lot of their features were intuition based and obvious wins. However, as the company grew, they realized the need for more experimentation, which is a big component of what I worked on. So the only experiment tool we had when I joined was a launch darkly hash function, which would tell you if a given customer would be in the experiment or control at the current time. But there was no indication of if the customer actually interacted with whatever feature you were trying to build. So while that worked for each feature, we could write custom queries for each feature implementation. It was not very scalable. So we built out the exposure logging framework last year and figured out a way to layer launch darkly flags so that we could increase experiment rollouts without reassigning our control and treatment users, and then built a dashboard with a set of key company metrics so that it became much lower effort to run experiments and understand their business impact. And then that takes me to today, where I'm currently at Webflow, which is a visual web design platform. And we're building out the product data science team, which means we're embedding data scientists within each product pillar so that data can help both ask and answer the key product questions and generate insights from data. We're still early in our product analytics journey, so oftentimes we're working with Eng to build and bring in new data sources, have to be very scrappy about where to find the data, defining and building out metrics and KPIs, and just it's more of a data culture shift where we're enabling PMs and business stakeholders to think more analytically and to set numerical goals. And we also finally have a somewhat modern tech stack. So we use DBT, which has been very helpful for learning the data model. We use Amplitude and Segment for our client event data, which unfortunately for us is a little lossy because I think if you have ad blockers on, the events get dropped. We use Census to send calculated and server data back to Amplitude. We create dashboards in Tableau for our business and product stakeholders, and we use Redash for slightly more savvy product managers and engineers. And I've personally also enjoyed using DeepNote as a collaborative Jupyter notebook. So in summary, as you can see from my journey over 5 different companies, the role of product analytics differs quite a lot at each company depending on the size and data maturity and problems that you will tackle. So some considerations as you consider your next product analytics role. One, what is the volume of data that the company works for? Where does it come from? Can you add new logging? And how much time will you have to spend cleaning your data so it's in a usable state? Next, understand the value of data. Is it actually used to drive product decisions, or is it more just a reporting function? And if you build a particular model, who will consume the outputs and how? And is the business sales driven, or is there room for experimentation? Also consider the data savviness of your stakeholders. Are they effective or SQL, or will you have to handhold a lot of the reporting and analyses? And lastly, I've spent a lot of time at growth companies scaling its data infrastructure, whether it's bringing in more data, adding logging, unifying naming conventions, building experiment dashboards, modeling, remodeling data. So I think understand where in the data journey the company is, what works for one data scientist or even 5 might not be effective or efficient as your team scales to 20 or 50 or more members. So oftentimes you're building tooling to solve challenges of scale. And that's the end of my presentation. So feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or stay in touch with me at my email.
That was awesome. I'm blown away. Both first, I was just like I was very, very impressed by the math, the education, and then just the experiences kind of just went ahead and blew my mind further. So I think, oh yeah, forgot we have a poll here. For those of you on the who are listening to this, the question is, what percent of data tools have changed in the last 12 months? I think this sounds, the answers are less than, I guess this is data tools at your company have changed in the last 12 months. Less than 10%, 10 to 25%, 25 to 50%, or 50 to 50% or more. What the trend is less than 10%. It sounds like you're not working at companies that are scaling like the ones that Wenqi was working at, based on the scaling problems that you're facing. What were you kind of anticipating with this question, Wenqi?
I think someone else actually wanted to ask this, so.
Oh, my bad. Well, this is a very interesting question. I guess if you had to have guessed, like what would you have put on here?
I think this came up in the Q&A that you wrote, is that oftentimes like companies go through a similar journey of the needs, because what works for one person or 5 people just doesn't scale as the company grows. So you spend a lot of time building tooling, and there's some like best in class, that's been done, or there's a lot of like pattern matching and pattern behavior of like what works well and what doesn't.
Yeah. Well, which I just kind of think it's what you said was really interesting of like, I learned things at Uber and Facebook, and I wanted to go apply them at other companies. I was like, man, that sounds crazy, because like the resources, the abilities, the funding you have at these companies to apply those, and also the scale of those problems. Like it's just trying to match those patterns in an appropriate way seems kind of interesting challenge.
Yeah, I
So
think
the
that
question,
was like Facebook was my first tech company, and I honestly didn't realize how good they had it until I left, because I thought it was standard that everyone had all the tools at their fingertips. And then I spent, I think, the next decade trying to replicate all their tools like where it was, 7 years ago.
Right. Just that one that you're like, hey, give me a change in a metric and then tell me all the relevant segments that Facebook had. It's just like, are you kidding me? That's like a week of work for like an analyst in many cases, and you're saying it's just at your fingertips. That's insane. So the question I had was, you've worked at a lot of big businesses with complex problems. What do you think is the most enduring theme across all the data problems you've faced?
I think quality different. I mean, everyone talks about data quality. I think they have different types of, because it's like garbage in, garbage out. But knowing like the types of quality issues are different, right? Like at Flexport, a human was entering the data, so there wasn't an easy way to actually just solve quality. It wasn't just like fix your pipeline, right? It's like thinking upstream, like who's entering the data and how do you actually set up more automated logging for things like that.
I've spent some time trying to help sourcing businesses think about digitization and analytics, and it's just like, maybe we should just work on other problems at the end of the day. So Flexport, they're taking a big chunk out of a tough problem. So can we? Oh shoot, Brittany, can we pull up the last slide that she brought up? I don't know if that's easy or hard to do. You have some really interesting considerations in here, and like I'm curious about the one that you thought was like, I want to like scream this from the rooftop, so I want everybody needs to know about this consideration. What do you have?
I think being more realistic about like your role when you go in is like, what is the data used for? I think that determines a lot of like your strategic value to the company when you go in. Like, do they just want like reporting, or like what is the value of data to the company?
What is the value of data generally, or within a specific kind of like relative to a product, or how do you
like, is it actually going to be used to drive like product decisions, right? Is that, and I think that's kind of shifted the B2C versus B2B, like different sides of companies that I've worked at.
You've been doing this for quite some time, like not a small amount of time now. How have your thoughts about like leading those discussions versus kind of like adopting what kind of decisions around that? How's that changed over time?
I think I've been looking for different opportunities to grow like during my career. I think in the beginning it was a lot of like tactical IC work that was much more like analytics and project focused. Now I think it's a lot more about enablement and how do you change data culture at a company holistically. And it's like
Yeah.
if you have 5 or 10 people, what are the processes you need to develop to make it easier for everyone to work together, instead of
Mhm.
just being scrappy and one off?
Yeah. Um, gosh, that's a talk. That's the talk I want to hear. So yeah, what in the like, let's say in that Webflow scale company, you're like 200 to 500 people somewhere in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ish. Um, what is like how are you? What are your big levers in terms of pushing and pulling around the data culture at Webflow?
I think we're very nascent, and there's actually been like a lot of the OKRs are around shipping certain products, but you don't really
Mm,
measure quantitatively the impact, right?
mhm.
So it starts with like data availability, like are we even logging the things so that we can measure them later? And
Yeah,
then from there, like I think we still use Tableau mostly, which is like pretty like user friendly. But like, how do you help people self serve their own
yeah,
data so that they can understand the decisions they're making?
yeah. I think man, you following up on Juan's talk is like perfect on this with regard to self serve. Also, how good is that feeling when you're like, hey, we need to start logging that, and then 3 months or whatever, 3 weeks later, you get to pat yourself on the back for saying like, we did it, and now I have it, and now everybody's smarter for it. Um, yeah, that's totally awesome. And like you also talked about like scrappiness and getting started. I think there's always that trade-off between being scrappy and getting going right now, and being like, oh, wish we had done this right the first time. So how do you think about like fast to market versus like longevity?
I would err actually on the more scrappy side. Just like oftentimes, I think this was like Juan's talk. That things start breaking when it's like 10 people, 20 people, but actually it
Yeah.
works when you're smaller than that. And I think just getting the fit and iterations, like I'd much rather get data in front of someone, whether or not
Hmm.
it's scalable or not, than being like, let me work on this process to make sure like everything is unified and
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. I mean, 80% correct data can at least point you directionally in the right way for sure. Also, just to reiterate, like that idea that he shared was the rules of three and tens was like, if you're thinking about scaling, breaking points at scale, it's like 3, 10, 30, 100, and kind of going out on that. So it's really an interesting that I want to reiterate to the folks at home. Um, well, Wenqi, this has been very, very interesting. If people want to reach out to you with more questions about kind of your experience, is that something you'd be able to do? And where would they be able to find you to do that?
Sure. I think I'm on your website. It was in the last slide, my email, and then I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Okay, sweet. And that's WenqiShao.
Yep.
I'm better at spelling it than saying it, so that's good. Uh, well, thank you for dropping all that knowledge on us today. After the break, we have about a 30-second break. We'll I feel like I should have like a funny intro for Will Sweet, but I don't. But we have the head of product experience at Datafold, Will Sweet, coming on, and the OA coffee attendee. So hang on closely. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I'm ready for lunch. And we'll be back in 30 seconds. Thanks again, Wenqi.